All right, yay, we're on. Okay, so welcome back. Welcome back to the Friday night live stream. As I said in the last couple too, Friday night at 7 seems to be working pretty well so far. Of course, that can always change, especially like as maybe schedules change and whatnot. But for right now, the 7 p.m. at on Facebook on Friday night seems to be working pretty well. And of course, if anything would ever need to change, I would let you know immediately. As soon as possible. Like say for instance, if we go back, you know, when we start having rehearsals again, because sometimes we do rehearse on Fridays and Saturdays, but I don't know, maybe we can have one day a midnight Friday night live stream. That might be fun. So, all right, it's actually starting to rain a little bit outside. Yeah, the weather was kind of off and on today. It was beautiful and sunny, and then of course it would then turn to rainy and kind of dreary out. So yeah, how's the weather where you're at? Let me know. Drop it in the comments, and I'm gonna take a swig of water. I have here another 18th century inspired mug made from my friend in the living history community, Mike Flaherty. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of dark. Before I take a swig of water, it's looking kind of dark. I'll be right back. I'm just gonna turn on another light, just so, I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah, that helps a little bit. Yeah, it was just looking, the screen was looking kind of dark, so I was, you know, just needed to adjust it. But yeah, now I'm going to take my swig of water from my 18th century inspired mug. Like I said, the guy's name is Mike Flaherty. He's awesome. He unfortunately does not have an online presence, at least that I know of, but he's very frequently at 18th century events, especially in the like the greater especially in like the Pittsburgh, North Hills area. So yeah, I've bought several of these from him, and I love them. I'm racking up a collection. This week I have a blue one. I think I had the green one last time, but blue, I figured, hey, matches my shirt. So cheers, whatever you're drinking. All right, so now the last couple of live streams I discussed a little bit more of the music side. I gave you guys first a little brief lesson on how I play the bowrin, and then last week I gave you a little bit of an insight to you know, the next couple of songs that I'm writing, well, not writing, but adapting, because they're old traditional folk songs, but I'm kind of like rearranging, arranging and adapting them. And those, you can, and all of my live streams, previous live streams are available on Facebook as well as some of my other platforms. And so you can go back and check those out if you haven't. But the songs I'm discussing in last week's live stream were my adaptations of John Barleycorn Must Die and Here's a Health to the Company. And those are both old folk songs from the from the British Isles, so in the Celtic Legion. So very much enjoying doing that, and I hope to bring you guys a finished product. And I'll also let you in on some original songs I'm writing too, but tonight we're going to focus more on my stories. So as some of you probably know, I released the beginnings of a book series called The Birthright. It's a dark historical fantasy series with you know, romance weaving into it, because, you know, hey, love and romance, it's all part of the human experience, so there is a bit of that going on there. You know, and it's all about human relationships, things like that, friendships, human relationships, marriage, romances. It's all about the human journey and, you know, just the whole human experience in general. But basically, I'm discussing a little bit of that tonight, and I'll read you a little excerpt from the very first book in the series, Descent. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what inspired me to write it. And of course, you know, some of you have been leaving some, you know, really awesome comments on the last couple of ones, but if you, you know, have a question for me, feel free to drop it in the comments and I'll try to answer it as soon as I see it. So, all right, so the idea came to me, I would say, like, actually quite a while ago, maybe like maybe 5 years ago. I would say like 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was quite a while ago that the idea came to me. And so what happened was I actually had a dream where I was sitting down and having a conversation with somebody who was going to ended up being a major character in the Birthright. And I'd never seen this person before in my life, I mean, at least not to my recollection. And they definitely seemed to be from another era, another time and place. And this person and I, we were just chatting, having a conversation. And by the time I woke up, I had no idea, you know, I couldn't tell you what the conversation was if my life depended on it. But for whatever reason, that person just stayed with me. And I was writing some short stories at the time and had published a couple. And I was just really getting this idea of, you know, this person and what their life might have been, and who knows, maybe my subconscious memory was remembering what the dream conversation was, but I just started, my mind just started playing out different scenarios for this character, and then and I started to just kind of just make little notes, just kind of write little stories, or not even like stories, just more like scenes for this person. Because for whatever reason, like I said, I couldn't shake this person from my mind. And so I would just kind of anytime I was on my laptop and a scene or whatever would come to mind, what I would do is, like I said, write a little scene, and that would be that. And then I started just getting ideas just for a storyline, actually a romantic storyline for this person. Now, originally, I had actually wanted it to be just a light, happy romance. However, I can't really seem to write light and happy. So I don't know what it is. Anytime I try to write light and happy, it just kind of I mean, it's okay, but nothing that I would want to write home about. Because my stories, they always seem to want to take a dramatic turn, or go into the dark crevices of the human psyche and everything. I don't know. My stories are just, so I don't even know where they come from half the time, to be honest with you. But I write them and they're there. So, but I started to kind of write this story for this character. And then it just sort of started evolving from there. More characters started to come on, and then I started exploring this person's genealogy too, because I was also at the time reading the book on Writing by Stephen King, and I was very much into the idea of really exploring just the innermost backstories of this person, which included their their genealogy, and I'm interested in my own genealogy as well. And you know, not that you would necessarily use each and every one of those details in the book, and it's weird because when you're writing a character and you're writing out, you're kind of just really writing out what makes that person, it's not even as though your audience has to know all of those little details, but you have to know them, you know? So So I just started just kind of like just exploring this character's genealogy. I started exploring just all of these really cool little facts about this person, and then like I started, and like I said, more characters started coming on. And it's interesting because most of basically all of the characters that are in the book Descent did not they actually were not even like they were not main characters at first. They were not main characters in the first in the first in the first, I guess, incarnation of the story. Descent was actually a completely different book when it first started out, but this character that I was dreaming about was going to be the focal point, but they ended up getting pushed ahead to a future installment. This person did, and I'll reveal who that person was like once that book comes out, but when I started like just really going into the backstories, I was like, I want to write about this person's ancestry. I want to write about like where exactly this person came from, and I'm a huge fan of, like, I don't know about you, but I'm a huge fan of like Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones. I'm very much into books that really get into a person's background and where exactly they came from. And that's what I really like about Tolkien, because, his writings do that. And C.S. Lewis also does to a degree as well. And of course, Game of Thrones, they do that too. So I've always enjoyed stuff like that. So I ended up going back further, and in doing that, that is how the book Descent became Descent. Now, as you know, I am a history person. Okay, I history and mythology, that really it really inspires what I do, and it inspires my writing, and inspires the music that I do, and I've mentioned that before in a couple, before as well. I run a history museum, so it's, history is a huge part of my life. But a lot of the research I did for this was, obviously I mentioned genealogy, just discovering the genealogy of the character. And of course, for that, I had to do research. A lot of the ancestry of a lot of the characters here is actually based off of my own ancestry and research that I've done. So there was that. And also I did some research on, obviously the ancient history, because especially it's going to be the fourth installment. That's going to go all the way back to ancient, the ancient world. I'm really looking forward to that one, writing that. And also Celtic lore, Celtic legend, mythology, all the ancient tribes, and of course fantasy themes and other worlds. Now, as far as my writing influences go, I mentioned Tolkien, I mentioned C.S. Lewis, Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series, and also I also really love the kind of more old-timey writers. I love writers from the Victorian era, especially when you're looking at, like kind of like the Gothic Romantic period. I love Edgar Allan Poe. I love Emily Bronte and her sister Charlotte. I really like the Grimm brothers. As if you're familiar with Grimm's fairy tales. And one interesting thing about fairy tales, I'm sure, we all grew up, we all grew up with with the whole Disneyized version of the fairy tales, and then later on went to read the actual original fairy tales and found that they were not so happy and bright and colorful, and they really were not. In fact, the original fairy tales were actually mostly written for adults, and they were more cautionary tales. And but one thing that always just fascinated me about the Grimm fairy tales was that the fact that a lot of them take place around a forest. And I have read in a couple different sources that the Grimm brothers, they were very much inspired by the Black Forest of Germany when they were writing their stories. I mean, if you look at, and if you haven't read any of them, if you go back to some of the more popular fairy tales like Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, just all of those, even you go to, now the Grimm brothers didn't write The Little Mermaid, a man named by the name of Hans Christian Andersen did, but even if you go back to that and just see the original stories, like I said, I mean, some people are horrified when they do that, because they grew up with, of course, the version that Disney gave to us. And, I love my Disney movies, but I also love my dark, Brothers Grimm fairy tales too. So those also had a very big influence on my stories as well. And when I was setting out to write the Birthright, all right, when I kind of gave up on the idea that it was going to be this bright, happy romance, when I set out to write it, and I kind of knew the direction that it was going in, I wanted it to kind of have that very old, dark kind of fairy tale vibe. It's sort of, it has elements of urban fantasy in it, because a lot of it does take place in, the real world, quote unquote. It does take place in much of the story. The first part of it, the first fourth of the book takes place in the year 1844. And then we fast forward later to 1931, and then the scenes just kind of interchange with each other. And then they're going, and then it's like the story kind of ties together at the end. So there are little flashbacks during the 1931 segments. There are little flashbacks to the back to the Victorian era, but I wanted to kind of have that. I wanted to have that very old world feel to it. I wanted to have that whole kind of fairy tale vibe. I wanted to have like almost like a I wanted the characters to also not always be very likable too. I think that's one thing that I do like about, like, say for instance, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. The thing about the characters that I really like, and I know, many people don't like, is that they're not very likable. Like Heathcliff and Kathy, they're not all, I mean, even if you can sympathize with their story, they're not always very likable, but it's important to also really try to understand why the characters are the way they are. And I do like how, and if you've never read the story of like Emily Bronte's the biography, any biography by Emily Bronte, I definitely recommend it. She's definitely was a very, very fascinating person. She lived much of her adult life, just shut away from the world, but yet she was able to just write and have these, just come up with these just really, really cool, like vivid characters that, that live on to this day. But that's one thing that I do like about Wuthering Heights, is that it really explores, how people can mean well and have the best of intentions, but sometimes like they're not the, they're not the most likable people when they're trying to get to that point, and I can do a whole thing on, on Wuthering Heights, and then that's one. And then Edgar Allan Poe, I like how, with his stories, he kind of doesn't quite tip his hand right away. He just places almost little clues throughout the story. And that's what I love. That's kind of what I tried to do with the Birthright. That's what I tried to do in writing, especially Descent, since Descent sets the stage for it all. And then, of course, I'm when we're talking, contemporary authors, I'm a big fan of Stephen King. I like a lot of his works. But I think, too, what I also like about some of the, I guess, pre-cinema authors, authors that, people that had, is the fact that they... when you read Emily Bronte, or you read, even like Jane Austen or Edgar Allan Poe or anyone from the olden times, from like centuries ago, you'll notice that their books are quite descriptive. They really, really just paint the picture. And they don't really leave any detail unturned. Now, to a modern, I like that type of writing, but I know to most modern audiences that might get a little bit boring and drawn out after a while. So if you're a modern writer that really likes to write in that way, you kind of have to find a happy medium, find a little middle ground where you can go to, where you can give them, where you can set the stage and just really give them that atmosphere and paint the picture, but not be too drawn out, And, but it's the same thing like on the other side, because of course, if you're one of those authors that writes very fast paced, dialogue driven stories, then of course you'll have, people on, saying, oh, well, their characters are one-dimensional and they didn't really get into character development really well. And those people tend to prefer like a more, descriptive type of story. So really it's all about writing what you like and finding the correct audience, for the right audience that is definitely going to enjoy your stories. So, yeah, hi to everyone who's given likes so far. I've seen those. Those are awesome. Thank you. And and the story also, like I said, has, takes place in different eras, 1844, 1931. And I'm going to read a little excerpt, okay? This is the book. All right. You can see that. Okay, and this is Descent. It's the very, very first book in the series. And then I have the novelette that came out that takes place between book 1 and book 2. It's so that's Sacred Atonement, but this is Descent. And this was definitely a labor of love. I absolutely enjoyed writing this. I enjoyed writing the characters and even just getting to know the characters too, because even as a writer, just when you think you know your characters and and if you're a writer, you probably can relate. Just when you think you know your characters and you think you know where the story's going, it always takes a surprising turn. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt from Descent. And in this book, Dorothy tends to, the character Dorothy, she's from the year 1931. She tends to have these very, very lucid dreams. And they started up, and she's in her last year of high school. And her lucid dreams, she's kind of had them off and on through her life, but they really started up at the beginning of her senior year of high school. And that's when they really started to grow and become more and more just vivid, and to a point to where she's almost not sure of whether she's having a dream or is it something else. Is she really maybe actually having an otherworldly experience? And this takes place on Halloween night, okay? She and her friends, they went up to the long closed down Fleming orphanage, which resides at the top of a hill in their town of Plains, New York, which is a fictional town. But in this fictional town is about 45 minutes outside of the city. And they had quite some interesting experiences up at the orphanage, and Dorothy and her boyfriend Carl had a couple of talks up there too, and it's really that's a part of the story I enjoyed writing too, but she just had that experience, and she ended up passing out at some point during the journey, during the Halloween escapade up to the Fleming orphanage. And yes, you do learn a lot more about the Fleming orphanage in the story, but she passed out. And her friends helped her get back to her house, and they called her parents and the town doctor, all of whom were at a town Halloween party for all the adults, and all the kids were out having their fun. And so this is, like I said, it's Halloween night in 1931, and Dorothy has woken up from passing out, but she's, fallen, maybe she's fallen back into sleep, maybe she hasn't, we'll see. All right. She had returned, or at least she thought. The forest did feel familiar. It was daylight, appearing to be just after sunrise. This time, there was no fog, and she could see that most of the trees, save for the coniferous trees, were nearly barren. Colors of red, orange, brown, and gold covered the woodland floor, and the scent of pine was prominent. As cool, crisp air raised the skin on her forearms, she listened for any sign of life, but heard only silence. While observing her surroundings, her eye caught what appeared to be a glow within some distant brush. The light wavered, orange, yellow, and red. A campfire, perhaps. As she started toward the area, the crunching of her shoes on the leaves echoed. When she looked down at herself, she was surprised to see a long white dress on her slight frame. From the cap sleeves and V-neck down to the hem touching the leaves on the ground, the dress was covered in white lace. It did not resemble anything she owned, but was still very familiar. She was positive she had worn the dress before, or was she simply supposed to be the one wearing it? As if being guided, she continued toward the glow. The echo of her steps grew louder, and she was concerned about attracting unwanted attention. But whatever prodded her along did not allow her steps to slow. Her heart pounded as she approached a clearing and saw a man-made fire. It was small, but burned with great strength. Wavering colors and shadows danced in the early morning light off the trees as smoke curled upward into the air. She took another step forward and savored the warmth. Footsteps approached from behind. She turned her head in the direction of the other presence and let out a gasp. It was him. Every one of her nerve endings shot up as the little Romani boy looked up at her. His dark eyes reflected sadness, and her heart broke for him all over again. Attempting to offer some comfort, she forced a smile, but the child remained solemn. "What's your name?" she asked. her voice providing the same hollow tin sound as before. The boy stared at her for another moment, before moving his gaze toward the fire. She stooped down to the child's level. "My name is Dorothy." "This is my brother's place," he answered, as if he hadn't heard her. "Who is your brother?" The boy faced her again. "He comes here a lot. It makes him happy." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "He brings her here. He doesn't know that I know, but she makes him happy. I think she is the only one who does." "You know where we are?" she slowly asked. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned and started walking into the brush. He paused and peered back as if expecting her to follow, even waiting, while she caught up. The boy seemed to know the woods well, and the two walked until they reached a large opening at the edge of the woods. A field with a small rundown brush at the center stretched out before them. The boy led her past a ghost town of huts. At the back of the cluster stood two sheds. He stopped at one, staring at it as though he were waiting for someone to emerge. When no one did, his face fell and he started walking again. When they reached the edge of the village, the boy halted and looked up at her. The two stood side by side, staring at a large, dark stone castle with red roofing looming in the near distance. "I know this place," she said. And I will leave you right there. All right, so that was an excerpt from Descent, the Birthright, which is the very first book in my series called The Birthright. And yeah, and I'll have a couple links below on where you can get it if if you're interested in checking it out. Now, as I said, I'm in the process of writing the second book, and I did mention that before, that I don't think I mentioned it before in this live stream, but last week I mentioned it. I believe I mentioned that the new music that I'm writing, it can actually serve as kind of a backdrop to this book series, in the sense that number one, the music that I'm doing, some of it is old traditional songs adapted, and even my original stuff, it is going to have a lot of themes from history and a lot of fantasy themes as well. It's going to have a very dark Celtic rock sound to it when all's said and done. And of course I'll be filling you in a little bit more on that as I proceed further with it. And yes, and of course the books and the music can be standalones too. I mean, if you only want to listen to the music or only want to read the books, that's fine. You don't have to do the two together. But hey, if you want to do the two, do the two together, listen to the music while you read the books, hey, you're more than welcome to. So yes, so that was this week's live stream. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about me writing my stories and my writing process of the stories, as opposed to how I typically write music. And next week I'm going to be back here at 7 p.m. and I'm going to be discussing a little bit more of my adventures in the living history world and how that all comes together to once again very much influence the stories I write and the music that I do. And I look forward to discussing that. I also look forward to debunking a few very, very popular historical myths that seem to make their way around and masquerade as fact. And a lot of people, and I will say that in my time in living history, you know, like you definitely learn a lot. I mean, reading history books, obviously, I mean, that's definitely very useful, and you learn a lot there, but there really is something to just getting hands-on and really just probably coming as close as you can to experiencing another era. My predominant era is the 18th century. However, I've also dabbled in other eras too, including the Victorian era, the Edwardian era, World War I. You know, so I've done a few different eras right now, and I'm also in a historical music group too. So so I've had plenty of research at my disposal, which has been really awesome. And but of course you do come across, you know, different historical myths that tend to drive you a little crazy every time you hear them being repeated as fact. And I am going to be, like I said, discussing a little bit more of that next week, and I can't wait. So all right, I hope you have a good night. I have to get on a phone call at 8 o'clock, and I hope yeah, hope to see you back here Friday at 7 p.m. Thanks for stopping by and tuning in, and I will, yeah, see you next week. All right, take care. Have a good night. I'll see ya.